Have you ever wondered how a country could be born in a single night, while millions cried, fled, and vanished into exile? In 1948, the world changed. A new flag was raised, and an old homeland was lost. This is not just a history lesson. This is the moment when two destinies collided forever. The story of Israel's birth isn't just written in documents and treaties. It's carved into memories, stitched into the scars of survivors, and whispered through generations. For the Jewish people, it was the return to a promised land after centuries of exile. For the Palestinians, it was the beginning of a catastrophe they still live with today. This is the story of borders drawn by powers far away, of hopes rising from the ashes of the Holocaust, and of a land torn between dreams and despair. This is the birth of Israel, as the world watched, and history wept. It began not in 1948, but far earlier, in the fading light of empires and the flickering flames of dreams. The 19th century saw Jewish thinkers and leaders reawakening an ancient hope to return to Zion. This movement, called Zionism, was more than ideology. It was survival. After centuries of persecution in Europe and Russia, the dream of a Jewish homeland was both political and spiritual. But this dream needed land, and Palestine, under Ottoman rule, became the imagined center. To many Jews, it was a return. To many Arabs, it was the beginning of uncertainty. The first Aliyah immigration wave came in the 1880s, with European Jews buying land in Palestine. They built farms, settlements, and small communities, often on lands purchased legally, but not without tension. Local Arabs, mostly peasants, suddenly found new neighbors speaking unfamiliar languages. At first, coexistence was uneasy, but not explosive, until British involvement complicated everything. When World War I shattered the Ottoman Empire, Britain took control of Palestine. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration changed everything. Britain supported a national home for the Jewish people. But what about the Arab majority already living there? They too had been promised independence for supporting the British against the Ottomans. What followed was 2 decades of conflicting promises, failed diplomacy, and rising anger. Jewish immigration increased, fueled by European anti-Semitism and rising Nazism. By the 1930s, Palestine was boiling. Arab revolts shook British control. Jewish defense groups, like Haganah, were formed. Then came the Holocaust, the darkest chapter of Jewish history. 6 million murdered, Europe burned, hope died, except for the idea of Israel. After World War II, surviving Jews had nowhere to go. The world's sympathy grew, but borders remained closed, especially in the West. Tens of thousands tried to enter Palestine illegally. British forces stopped them. Many were imprisoned in Cyprus camps. Global pressure on Britain mounted. Jewish armed groups turned to resistance, sometimes violently. The King David Hotel bombing in 1946 shocked the world. It was clear Britain could no longer hold Palestine. The United Nations proposed a solution in 1947: partition the land. Jews accepted, Arabs rejected. They saw it as theft of their homeland. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared Israel's independence. Within hours, Arab armies invaded, war erupted. Villages were destroyed, cities divided, hundreds of thousands displaced. For Jews, it was independence. For Palestinians, it was the Nakba, the catastrophe. The map changed, borders shifted, lives shattered, and a conflict began that still echoes through every news report and every broken heart in the region. But before we go deeper into the wars, the peace talks, and the lives torn apart, we must understand how promises, dreams, and desperation gave birth to the most controversial country in modern history. The morning after Israel declared independence, 5 Arab armies launched an invasion. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq each moved in from a different border. To the Arab world, This was not just a military action. It was a rescue mission for their Palestinian brothers, a fight to stop what they saw as colonization to Israel. It was the war for survival, a newborn nation, barely armed, facing annihilation before it could take its first steps. The Jewish population, hardened by the Holocaust and trained in underground militias, fought back fiercely. From kibbutzim to cities, from hills to coastal plains, every inch of land became a battlefield. Jerusalem, the holy city, was torn in half. West Jerusalem held by Jews, east by Jordanian forces, and the old city became a fortress of sorrow. But beneath the clash of armies was something more tragic, more permanent, the human cost. As war raged, over 700,000 Palestinians fled or were forced from their homes. Some left in fear of combat. Others were expelled in Israeli military operations. Entire villages emptied, their homes left standing, but silent. To Palestinians, this became the Nakba, the catastrophe, not just a war, but a dismembering of identity, heritage, and history. Families crossed borders thinking they'd return in days. Many never did. Generations were born in refugee camps, stateless, rootless, waiting. The newly formed Israel said. They left on orders from Arab leaders. Palestinians said, "We were driven out by fear and fire." Truth lives somewhere in between, shaded by propaganda, politics, and pain. But what is undeniable is the scale of the loss and the depth of the wound. In cities like Haifa and Jaffa, Arab and Jewish families once lived side by side. Now, streets were changed, names replaced. Doors once open now shuttered forever. Across the borders, new refugee camps sprang up in Lebanon, Jordan, Gaza, and the West Bank. Tents turned into tin shacks, then into permanent homes, but never into peace. Meanwhile, inside Israel, a different story unfolded. The population swelled as Jews from war-torn Europe and Arab countries poured in. Iraqi Jews, Yemeni Jews, Moroccan Jews, many fleeing their own rising persecutions. They brought color, culture, cuisine, but also stories of pain and flight. Within just a few years, Israel's Jewish population doubled. A new national identity was forged, fast, strong, but not without internal struggles. The state focused on building roads, cities, farms, schools, but it also passed laws that complicated the return of Palestinian refugees. The Absentee Property Law of 1950 gave the state control of lands left behind. Houses, olive groves, entire neighborhoods, now legally owned by someone else. For many in the diaspora, this wasn't just a legal technicality. It was the erasure of memory, home keys kept as relics of a life stolen. At the United Nations, debate exploded. Resolution 194 was passed, calling for the right of return or compensation. Israel accepted UN membership, but not the refugee clause. Arab states rejected Israel's existence altogether. And so, the battle shifted from fields to forums, from rifles to microphones, from tanks to television. The War of 1948 ended with armistice lines, not peace treaties. Borders were drawn, but bitterness remained raw and rising. The West Bank came under Jordan's rule. Gaza was controlled by Egypt, but no Palestinian state emerged. The dream remained suspended in the air. And the new state of Israel, though victorious, knew peace was far away. What had been won in blood would now be defended in fear. This was not the end, only the beginning, a beginning written in exile for some, and in return for others. For Jews, it was the rebirth of a long-lost home. For Palestinians, it was the beginning of a long, still ongoing, journey without one. And the world, once united in post-war hope, now stood divided again, this time over a strip of land no bigger than New Jersey, but with history deeper than empires. As Israel took its place on the world map, the globe turned to watch and judge. Some saw the birth of a miracle. Others saw the seeds of a permanent war. In the halls of the United Nations, Israel's admission was both celebrated and protested. 33 countries had supported its creation in 1947. 13 opposed, 10 abstained. The Soviet Union, to everyone's surprise, was among Israel's early supporters. So was the United States, driven by both humanitarian guilt and strategic interests. But the Arab world, still reeling from the humiliation of defeat, hardened its stance. Embassies closed, boycotts began, refugees multiplied. Egypt, Syria, Iraq, each doubled down on anti-Israel rhetoric. The idea of peaceful coexistence was drowned under national pride and public rage. Israel, meanwhile, played a careful balancing act. It needed allies, badly, but not just military ones. Economic, cultural, and diplomatic too. In the West, Jewish communities rallied to support the new state. Funds poured in, volunteers arrived, arms were smuggled, often through backdoor networks. Hollywood stars spoke in support. American synagogues lit candles of hope. For many, Israel wasn't just a country. It was a symbol of survival, of justice after genocide. But for Palestinians and their allies, it was a symbol of betrayal. And as the Cold War deepened, the Middle East became another chessboard. The US saw Israel as a potential democratic stronghold in a volatile region. The USSR, watching Arab nationalism rise, saw an opportunity to court the Muslim world. So it armed Egypt, trained Syrian officers, and whispered promises to Iraq. The battlefield of history now extended to ideology. It wasn't just Arabs versus Israelis. It was capitalism versus communism, East versus West. Israel's early leaders, like David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir, were secular but tough. They believed in Jewish self-determination and in arming fast before the next war came. And it did come. Though the guns of 1948 had quieted, they were never laid down. Skirmishes flared on borders, refugee infiltrations, retaliatory raids, and political assassinations became common. Trust was not just broken, it had never truly existed. Internationally, Israel walked a tightrope. It aligned closely with France and Britain in the 1950s, especially during the Suez Crisis. In 1956, when Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, Israel saw a chance. It joined a secret plan with France and the UK to invade Egypt and punish Nasser. Israeli troops stormed the Sinai. Victory came quickly, but condemnation came faster. The United States and the Soviet Union, bitter rivals, both demanded Israeli withdrawal. It was a moment that taught Israel two things. First, military success means little without political cover. Second, America is the key to long-term survival. From then on, Israel tilted westward, not just in foreign policy, but in culture, economy, and identity. American aid increased, so did military cooperation, intelligence sharing, and cultural diplomacy. By the 1960s, Israel was no longer a fragile experiment. It was a rising power, bold, innovative, and deeply woven into global politics. But the Palestinian issue refused to fade. At every global summit, Arab leaders raised their voices for the displaced. Refugee camps became centers of resistance and rage. New generations, born without homes, grew up under occupation and statelessness. Tensions didn't only simmer, they boiled. And they would soon erupt again, violently, in wars that would redraw maps and scar souls. Back home, Israel faced a paradox. It wanted peace, but trusted no one. It craved stability, but knew war was inevitable, so it built faster, stronger. Tanks rolled, aircraft were purchased, and youth trained in survival from the moment they could walk. The world kept watching, often with split eyes. Was this a David among Goliaths, or a Goliath cloaked in David's robes? What was certain? The Middle East had entered a new age. An age where history didn't heal wounds, it kept opening them. The Cold War powers fueled the fire, supplying arms instead of answers. Each side funded their allies and fed the flames of forever conflict. In the global media, Israel became both hero and villain, depending on who told the story. In the West, it was often framed as a brave nation among enemies. In the Arab world, it was an occupier with powerful friends, and the Palestinians, once again, became the ghosts in the background. Ghosts with voices, with dreams, with anger, growing louder by the year. And the world, it kept turning, it kept trading, and it kept forgetting. But for the people of the land, Israeli and Palestinian, nothing was ever forgotten. Not the homes lost, not the wars fought, not the promises made and broken. This wasn't just a political battle anymore. It had become generational, rooted in memory, myth, and mourning. And as the world turned to the next decade, the region braced itself for the next explosion. By the summer of 1967, tensions across the Middle East were no longer simmering, they were boiling. Border clashes, airspace violations, and fiery speeches lit the skies like sparks before a storm. Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, became the face of Arab resistance. A charismatic leader, he promised to crush Israel and liberate Palestine. Nasser expelled UN peacekeepers from the Sinai Peninsula. Then he closed the Straits of Tiran, Israel's vital shipping route, an act considered a declaration of war. Israel waited for no more signs. On June 5, 1967, it launched a preemptive strike that would shock the world. In just hours, Israeli fighter jets wiped out the Egyptian Air Force, still on the ground. Jordan and Syria joined the war. They too suffered massive losses. In only 6 days, Israel achieved what once seemed impossible. It seized the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The map of the Middle East was rewritten with lightning speed. For Israelis, it was a miracle. For Arabs, a disaster worse than 1948. Jerusalem, divided since 1948, was now whole under Israeli control. Soldiers cried at the Western Wall, religious Jews wept, the city echoed with prayers and triumph. But another wall had just begun to rise, a wall between peoples, not stone. Over 1 million Palestinians now lived under Israeli occupation. Military checkpoints, curfews, and governance by foreign hands became their new reality. For many Israelis, this was seen as a return to biblical lands, Judea and Samaria. For Palestinians, it was the tightening of the chain, a life where their land was still their memory, but not their possession. The world watched, stunned. Israel's military brilliance impressed allies and enemies alike. The US strengthened its support, seeing Israel as a crucial Cold War partner. Weapons deals increased, aid expanded. A special relationship was born, but so too did resistance. The Palestinian Liberation Organization PLO, formed in 1964, now gained immense support. Led by Yasser Arafat, the PLO promised armed struggle. They claimed the right to return, not just to the West Bank, but to all of historic Palestine. Guerrilla warfare began to rise. Hijackings, bombings, and border attacks became common headlines. Israel responded with raids, surveillance, and military pressure. Civilians on both sides paid the heaviest price. Meanwhile, Israel debated its future. Should the land be traded for peace, or kept forever? Some believed in the Greater Israel concept, a homeland stretching from river to sea. Others feared the moral and demographic consequences of long-term occupation. In international law, the territories were labeled occupied. UN Resolution 242 called for Israel to withdraw from territories occupied in the recent conflict, but the language was vague, intentionally so. Withdrawal from all territories, some with conditions. No one agreed. And so, ambiguity became policy. For decades, negotiations would circle this single line, without ever landing. In the Arab world, the 1967 defeat cut deep. At the Khartoum Conference, Arab leaders issued the famous 3 no's, No peace with Israel. No recognition of Israel. No negotiations with Israel. This hardened posture kept the region in a deep freeze. Neither war nor peace, just silence and shadows. Meanwhile, Israel absorbed the victory. New settlements were built in occupied territories, small at first, then expanding. The international community protested, but real pressure was rare and largely symbolic. As years passed, occupation became infrastructure. Roads, housing, laws all grew roots. Palestinians found themselves increasingly divided. Some clung to hope for diplomacy. Others turned to violence. The Israeli public, too, was divided. Security versus justice, peace versus possession. In the background, a new generation of Palestinians was coming of age. Raised under occupation, surrounded by walls, but filled with memory. Memory of orchards, homes, keys, and a freedom they'd never seen, only heard in lullabies. And in Israel, a generation raised on survival, and war grew tough and alert. Each side saw themselves as victims. Each side claimed justice. Each side feared annihilation. And once again, the world watched. And once again, the world did little. But time doesn't stop, it compounds. And by the time the next major war arrived, the wounds of 1967 were still raw. 6 days had created a new map, but peace, that would take decades, and even now, remains out of reach. In October 1973, as Jews observed Yom Kippur, their holiest day, silence turned to sirens. Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a surprise attack, catching Israel off guard. It was an assault not just on borders, but on Israeli confidence. What was once seen as invincible suddenly bled in the sand. Egypt stormed across the Suez Canal with stunning speed. Syria pushed deep into the Golan Heights, reclaiming lost ground. The Israeli defense forces scrambled, reserves were called, tanks rolled. The war became existential once again for the Arab world. It was revenge for 1967 for Israel. It was another test of survival. The first days were brutal, but by the second week, momentum shifted. Israeli forces counterattacked. They crossed into Egyptian territory and surrounded the Third Army. In the north, they regained the Golan and pushed toward Damascus. The world froze. Nuclear powers stood on edge. US and Soviet forces went on alert. America rushed weapons to Israel via massive airlifts. The Soviet Union resupplied Arab forces with tanks and arms. It wasn't just a regional war. It became a global crisis. Oil prices skyrocketed. The Arab world declared an embargo. Gas lines stretched across western cities. For the first time, Americans asked, "Why are we so deeply involved?" This war cracked open the conversation. Suddenly, support for Israel came with questions. In Europe, student protests demanded Palestinian rights. In the US, editorials began to mention occupation and two states. And for Palestinians, something else changed, a reawakening of political identity. They were no longer just refugees or background casualties. They began to speak, loudly, defiantly, globally. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, took center stage. Yasser Arafat, wearing his iconic keffiyeh, addressed the United Nations in 1974. He said, "I come bearing an olive branch and a freedom fighter's gun." The world listened. Some with support, others with suspicion, but they listened for the first time, truly. Palestine was no longer just a land. It was a cause, a flag, a people, a political force with growing international recognition. Meanwhile, Israel emerged victorious again, but wounded, shaken, and questioning. The myth of invincibility was gone. A deep political reckoning began. Mass protests shook Israeli streets. The government of Golda Meir fell. The Israeli public began to feel the weight of war, not just its necessity. What would peace look like? And what price was too high? In Egypt, something unexpected stirred. President Anwar Sadat, once an enemy, began to consider diplomacy. In 1977, Sadat stunned the world by visiting Jerusalem. He addressed the Israeli Knesset, speaking of peace, dignity, and coexistence. The moment was historic, unimaginable just years before. To enemies standing together, shaking hands, in front of the world, the US stepped in as mediator. At Camp David in 1978, peace was drafted between Egypt and Israel. Israel agreed to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula. Egypt became the first Arab country to officially recognize Israel. But peace came with a price. Egypt was isolated in the Arab League. Sadat was later assassinated by extremists. And for Palestinians, the peace felt like betrayal. Their future had not been discussed, their land still occupied. The West Bank and Gaza remained under Israeli control. Refugees remained in limbo. Jerusalem still divided in hearts, if not maps. But the seed had been planted. If Egypt and Israel could make peace, perhaps others could too. Yet in the shadows, frustration grew. Palestinian youth, born in refugee camps and under occupation, carried a different fire. Their resistance was no longer just speeches or symbolic acts. It became organized, calculated, and, sometimes, deadly. Hijackings, hostage crises, and global headlines followed. Groups like Black September made the world listen. Even if through fear, the Israeli response hardened. Mossad began global missions, hunting those responsible for attacks. In Munich, 1972, Israeli athletes were murdered by Palestinian gunmen. In retaliation, Israel launched Operation Wrath of God, assassinations across continents. The conflict had gone global. No place was too far, no border too sacred. In the middle of it all, civilians continued to suffer. Innocent lives caught between resistance and retaliation. Journalists now told both sides of the story, sometimes, but narratives remained deeply divided. To many in the West, Israel remained the democratic ally in a sea of dictatorships. To others, Palestinians were the underdog, fighting for a homeland denied. The complexity deepened. No one wore pure white or black, only shades of history. And yet, from this chaos, a realization emerged. Without acknowledging both peoples, there would be no peace. The wars of the past had not solved the question. They had only made it louder. And now, as the world entered the 1980s, that question echoed louder than ever. In mosques, synagogues, parliaments, and refugee camps. The year was 1987. The spark came from a car crash in Gaza, 4 Palestinians dead after being hit by an Israeli vehicle. It could have been just another tragedy, but the grief erupted into fury, and fury became a movement. Stones flew across the alleys of Gaza and the streets of the West Bank. Young Palestinians, many born under occupation, rose up with nothing but fists and fire.
It was called the First Intifada, meaning shaking off, a grassroots uprising. No armies, no tanks. Just children, mothers, and broken roads. Images flooded Western television. Boys throwing rocks at soldiers, women wailing, smoke rising over refugee camps. For the first time, global audiences saw Palestinians not as terrorists, but as people, human hurt, defiant. Israel responded with force, curfews, mass arrests, beatings, rubber bullets, and real ones. But the uprising didn't end. It grew from city to city, street to street, school to school. New voices rose from within Palestine, not just the old Pala leadership abroad, but activists on the ground. And among them, a shadow emerged. Hamas, a group born out of Gaza's mosques, combining religion with resistance. Unlike the secular plow, Hamas offered Islamic nationalism. It rejected Israel's existence entirely, and soon gained deadly momentum. Bombings, attacks, suicide missions. A new, darker chapter opened, and with it, Israel faced a moral labyrinth. How does a democracy fight an enemy hidden in shadows? When the battlefield is inside homes, markets, buses, and cafes. By the early 1990s, both sides were exhausted. Israel wanted calm. Palestinians wanted dignity. The world wanted a deal. And so came Oslo, a quiet, secret negotiation in Norway. No cameras, just words, risk, hope. In 1993, the world watched history. Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin shaking hands on the White House lawn. US President Bill Clinton stood between them, arms wide, smiles forced. The moment was electric, a promise, a beginning. The Oslo Accords established the Palestinian Authority. Gaza and parts of the West Bank would be governed by Palestinians themselves. In return, the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist, and violence on both sides was meant to end. But Oslo was built on clouds. Final issues: Jerusalem, refugees, borders were left for later. That later never came. Instead, settlements expanded. Checkpoints remained. Trust eroded. Israelis were split. Some celebrated peace, others called Rabin a traitor. In 1995, at a peace rally, Rabin was assassinated, not by a Palestinian, but by a right-wing Israeli extremist. The peace process bled from within, and it never fully recovered. Meanwhile, in Palestinian society, faith in diplomacy began to die. Corruption plagued the new authority. Daily life barely improved, and in the wings, Hamas waited, gaining support with every Israeli bulldozer, every broken promise. What Oslo gave with one hand, reality snatched with the other. By the early 2000s, the second eruption came. The second intifada, this time, darker, bloodier, unrelenting. Suicide bombings tore through Israeli cities. Buses exploded. Cafes turned to ash. Children lost limbs. Mothers lost hope. Israel retaliated with crushing force. Targeted assassinations, curfews, bombings in Gaza. Entire buildings turned to dust. And then came the wall. A massive concrete barrier snaking through the West Bank, dividing, separating, enclosing. To Israel, it was defense, a shield against terror. To Palestinians, it was a cage, the wall of a prison without trial. Every morning, thousands lined up at checkpoints. Permits, searches, delays. Life paused at every turn. Tensions deepened. On both sides, moderates were drowned out by extremism. The dream of peace faded. The word two states became a ghost, spoken but never summoned. Internationally, sympathy fractured. Some still stood firmly with Israel. Others now saw Palestinian struggle as legitimate resistance. Western campuses debated. Human rights organizations published reports. The narrative was no longer one-sided. Inside Israel, fear ruled, but so did fatigue. Generations had grown up under threat and under armor. Inside Palestine, rage fermented, but so did loss of land, of leadership, of hope. And through all this, the children kept growing. Some under occupation, some behind the wall, some behind the trigger. What Oslo began with a handshake ended with a clenched fist. Yet even now, buried in the rubble of failed peace, lingered a whisper maybe, still, one day.
In 2005, after decades of occupation and endless conflict, Israel made a bold move. It unilaterally withdrew all its troops and settlers from the Gaza Strip. The world held its breath. Could this be a path to peace, or just a strategic retreat? For Israelis, it was a painful decision. Families dragged from homes, synagogues dismantled, settlers weeping at bulldozers. For Palestinians, it felt like a victory, hard-earned and historic. At last, one piece of land truly theirs, without a single Israeli soldier inside. But the celebration didn't last. Soon, power struggles erupted between Palestinian factions. Hamas and Fatah, once allies in the resistance, turned on each other. In 2006, Hamas won the elections. In 2007, they seized full control of Gaza. Fatah retreated to the West Bank, and just like that, Palestine was split, politically, geographically, and ideologically. Hamas ruled Gaza with an iron fist. To Israel and the West, it was a terrorist organization. To many Gazans, it was governance born in rage. Israel responded by tightening the noose. A full blockade by land, air, and sea, meant to contain Hamas, but it caged a million civilians. The world's most densely populated strip of land became a prison. No airport, no seaport, electricity for a few hours a day. Goods were restricted. People couldn't leave. A mother in labor, a student with a scholarship, a dying patient, all trapped. And then came the rockets. Hamas and other militant groups began firing crude projectiles into southern Israel. Sirens screamed. Bomb shelters filled. Children in Sderot learned to run before they learned to write. In response, Israel struck back with overwhelming force. Operation Cast Lead, Operation Pillar of Defense, Operation Protective Edge, each one more brutal than the last. Entire Gaza neighborhoods flattened, civilians buried in rubble. And schools hit, hospitals overwhelmed. The death tolls told a grim story. Thousands of Palestinians dead, many of them children. Israel defended its actions, saying Hamas used civilians as human shields. Hamas claimed resistance, Israel claimed defense. The truth lay under collapsed roofs. The media wars began too. Viral videos, hashtags, global protests, everyone had a side. In Europe, demonstrations flooded the streets. In America, debates tore through college campuses and newsrooms. In Tel Aviv, fear became routine. In Gaza, survival became defiance. For every rocket, there was a drone. For every funeral, another vow for revenge. And the world, again, watched, and again, did almost nothing. Ceasefires came and went like whispers. Negotiations started in Cairo, Doha, and New York, and ended in silence. Each time, the war stopped. But the suffering didn't. The siege remained. The wounds deepened. Children in Gaza grew up never seeing the sea, though they lived beside it. Children in Israel learned siren drills before bedtime stories, and hope, it shrank, folded into the corners of cracked classrooms and broken masks. Still, people held on. Artists painted hope on concrete walls. Teachers taught peace between airstrikes, and yet, every few years, war returned, like a cycle cursed to repeat, each time worse, each time more hopeless. The UN called Gaza unlivable by 2020. That warning came and went, but Gaza still stood, barely, and then, in the silence between wars, came new sparks. Marches at the border, protests with flags, bullets flew again. More funerals, more hashtags, more statements from governments that changed nothing. In Israel, politics shifted right, security ruled ballots. Peace became a forgotten promise. In Gaza, grief hardened into fury. Dreams became chants, chants became rocks, rocks became rockets. And somewhere between checkpoints and charred buildings, the question returned, is this life, or just survival? Internationally, the narrative shifted slowly. No longer was it just defending democracy. Now people questioned the cost. Documentaries showed bleeding children, not just burned buses. Global audiences began to see Gaza, not just Hamas, but sympathy rarely leads to policy, and policy rarely leads to peace. And so, the blockade stayed. So did Hamas, so did fear. So did the silence of the world, broken only by the next explosion. And always, the same questions: who started it, who ended it, who paid for it, and under it all, the same truth remained. No one wins a war fought inside homes. No one forgets a life lived under fire. The ground shook, the sky fell, and yet, both sides stood again, wounded, yes, but never finished. Because in Gaza and in Israel, survival is not just instinct, it's identity. Once, the Arab world stood united under a single cry: no peace with Israel, no recognition, no negotiation. That cry echoed from Cairo to Casablanca, from Baghdad to Beirut, a shield for Palestine. But decades passed, wars came and went, leaders fell. Generations shifted, new questions began to rise. Can we afford eternal war? Can we trade resistance for renaissance? By the 2000s, silence crept into Arab capitals. Lip service to Palestine remained, but action faded. In Gulf palaces and boardrooms, Israel was no longer just the enemy. It was a tech power, a cybersecurity hub, a gateway to Washington. Secret meetings took place, first in Europe, then in Dubai. Intelligence shared, business explored, enemies began to whisper peace. And then, in 2020, came the Abraham Accords, a thunderbolt masked in smiles and handshakes. The UAE normalized relations with Israel, soon followed by Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. It was historic. Airlines opened new routes. Embassies were announced. Tourists walked Tel Aviv beaches speaking Arabic. Israelis snapped selfies in Dubai malls, but in Ramallah, and Gaza. The news landed like betrayal. Decades of Arab promises, undone in a press conference. Palestinian leaders called it a stab in the back. Hamas declared it treason. To Arab governments, it was strategy. They cited economic growth, Iran's threat, and the need to move forward. But to Palestinians, it was abandonment. The idea of Arab brotherhood, replaced by business deals and silence. The Abraham Accords claimed to promote peace, but they offered none to the people still under occupation. No checkpoints removed. No settlements halted. No refugee returned. No capital in East Jerusalem. For the Gulf, it was about modernization. For Israel, it was legitimacy without concession. For America, it was a foreign policy trophy. For Palestine, it was a painful confirmation the Arab world had moved on. The cause was no longer central. It was ceremonial. Protests still erupted in Oman, Cairo, and Tunis, but they faded fast, buried beneath pandemic headlines and economic crashes. Even traditional allies like Jordan began to whisper frustration, not over Israel, but over Palestinian leadership. Corruption, division, internal power struggles. The Palestinian cause was bleeding from both outside and within, and in Tel Aviv, the shift was embraced. Peace without compromise, relations without retreat. But under this new diplomacy, another truth remained. Peace signed by governments rarely reflects peace felt by people. The streets of Gaza remained the same. So did the separation wall, the refugee camps, the occupied zones. Israel's foreign policy was soaring, but its domestic reality remained trapped in a cycle of fear and fire. Palestinians, watching from rooftops and ruins, felt the ground shift beneath their feet, again, not in their favor. Hope became internal, local, no longer waiting for Arab kings or American presidents. And yet, the world noticed. Documentaries, articles, books, voices rising from the margins. Artists, poets, and young activists reframed the story, from being victims to becoming narrators. The Abraham Accords reshaped diplomacy, but not the destiny of those still stateless. It was the beginning of a new era, one where the Palestinian cause stood alone, not forgotten, but no longer protected. And as regional powers toasted to progress, the silence from occupied streets grew louder. For peace without justice is not peace, it is postponement.
In 2021, the world's attention snapped back to Jerusalem, not for peace talks but for pending evictions. In a small neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah, Palestinian families faced displacement again. They had lived there since 1948, refugees from another war. Now, Israeli settlers claimed legal ownership of the same land. Protests erupted. Palestinian youth stood between homes and bulldozers. Videos went viral, an old woman refusing to leave. A man saying, "If I don't steal it, someone else will." The tension spilled into Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of Islam's holiest sites, turned into a battlefield of tear gas and flash bombs. On the 27th night of Ramadan, worshippers were attacked mid-prayer. It lit a fuse soaked in 70 years of fuel. Hamas responded with rockets, hundreds fired toward Israeli cities, Tel Aviv, Ashkelon, Beersheva. Israel retaliated with massive airstrikes on Gaza. Buildings collapsed, children pulled from rubble. The world watched. On phones, in real time, hashtags trended. Hashtag Save Sheikh, JARRAH, hashtag Gaza.
Protests broke out in London, New York, Karachi, Johannesburg. Millions marched, waving flags, chanting names, holding up photos of victims. But governments responded with the same old statements. Israel has the right to defend itself. All sides must de-escalate. For many, it felt like déjà vu. The cycle, rocket, airstrike, funeral, ceasefire, repeat. But this time was different, because the world wasn't just watching, it was reacting. Mainstream media began using words once taboo. Occupation, apartheid, ethnic cleansing. Even in the US Congress, a new generation spoke out. They named names. They questioned billions in aid. For the first time in decades, the narrative wasn't one-sided. It was messy, complicated, honest. In Israel, sirens echoed through the night. Families huddled in shelters, Fear was real. In Gaza, fear was constant. No sirens, no shelters, only prayers. Journalists reported live as towers fell. Cameras captured grief in its rawest form. The death toll rose. Mostly Palestinians. Children, women, entire families erased in a moment. Hospitals overflowed. Electricity failed. The blockade made basic supplies nearly unreachable, and still, the rockets came, and still, the jets returned. When the ceasefire came, it was fragile. A pause, not a peace. People emerged from rubble and dust. But the damage ran deeper than walls. It reached memory. In 2022, tensions flared again. Smaller scale, same fury. Settler marches through Jerusalem. More raids on Al-Aqsa. In 2023, violence reached new extremes. An Israeli raid in Jenin killed multiple youths, including a 16-year-old girl. Hamas fired back. Israel bombed refugee camps. And the numbers kept climbing. The grief deepened. Inside Israel, the far right rose. Ministers with openly racist rhetoric joined the government. Settlements expanded. Again, laws were passed to weaken the judiciary. Democracy trembled. And the West, it whispered, but didn't act. Aid kept flowing. Weapons kept shipping. Meanwhile, in Gaza, another generation grew up under siege. Without clean water, without dreams, without escape. And in Tel Aviv, another generation grew up in fear. Trusting no one, expecting nothing but the next red alert. Across the ocean, people debated in universities, boardrooms, and dinner tables. They argued history, morality, legality. But in the streets of Rafah and Lod, there was no debate. Only survival. What began as a land dispute had become a global symbol. A mirror reflecting colonialism, resistance, trauma, and hope, all at once, and still no solution. Only statements, summits, stalemates, but deep in the rubble, voices remain, saying, "We are still here," whether in Gaza, Ramallah, Haifa, or Hebron. Palestinians remain rooted, bruised, but breathing. And in Israeli streets, too, another truth stands. Peace is not the enemy, fear is. Because every mother wants the same thing, a future where her child wakes up, without sirens or smoke. This is not just a story of land. It's a story of loss, identity, survival, and longing. For Israelis, the birth of their nation was redemption. A return from ashes, a miracle after madness. For Palestinians, it was the beginning of catastrophe, al-Nakba, the great disappearance, the scattering of a people. Two truths were born on the same soil, each claiming history, each carrying scars, and in between, the land stayed silent, watching generations bleed over boundary lines drawn in pain. Maps were made and remade, but hearts didn't follow ink, they followed memory. In Tel Aviv, memory speaks of pogroms and gas chambers, of ships denied at ports, of finally having a home that couldn't be taken. In Gaza, memory speaks of olive trees bulldozed, of grandfathers holding rusted house keys, of freedom that only lived in stories. One side sees survival, the other sees suffocation. One sees rockets raining down, the other sees drones circling endlessly. Each mother rocks her child to sleep with different lullabies, but both whisper, "I just want you to live, the world has tried." Unresolutions, peace plans, roadmaps, all now gather dust. Presidents promised change. Prime ministers shook hands, but the fences stayed. Because you can sign a treaty, but you can't sign away grief. Palestinians want freedom, dignity, and return. Israelis want safety, recognition, and permanence. Both want peace, but neither trusts the other to give it. Walls now stand where neighbors once traded spices. Watchtowers now overlook playgrounds. The call to prayer and the cry of the shofar echo in the same sky, but never in harmony. And yet, humanity still flickers. A Jewish medic saving a Palestinian child. A Muslim shopkeeper offering water to Israeli soldiers. Moments, fleeting, fragile, but real? What if peace isn't in summits, but in those quiet moments of shared kindness? What if borders are less powerful than memory, and less permanent than love? Because this story, this long, bitter story, does not end in war. It ends in choice, a choice not yet made, the choice to see the other, not as threat, but as neighbor, to look beyond the walls, and into the eyes of a mother who wants the same thing. This is not naive, it is necessary, because the alternative is more graves, more silence, more ruins mistaken for victory. The birth of Israel changed the world, but the rebirth of humanity, that's the real miracle still waiting. From the ashes of Auschwitz to the alleyways of Gaza, from sacred stones to shattered homes, one truth remains: until both sides are free, neither truly is. And so, in a land where time stands still and every stone holds a memory, the story remains, unfinished, raw, and deeply human. History doesn't end with answers, sometimes, it just leaves us with better questions. What does it mean to belong? Who decides a homeland? And how long can two people live apart on the same land? If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think, then you are part of the legacy. Here at Legacy of Nations, we don't just tell history, we bring voices back to life. From the forgotten empires to today's living struggles, we honor every side, every silence, every sacrifice. Subscribe to the channel, because some stories aren't just watched, they're remembered. This was the birth of Israel, a story not of endings, but echoes. I'm your name or your narrator, and this is Legacy of Nations, where history breathes and never forgets.